Special edition, vintage fashion. For the last 15 years, New York has had its own vintage fashion show. Now Paris has one too. 3 styles, 3 stylists, all women, whose passion for vintage clothes goes back at least a decade.
The interest has existed for even longer than that because there have always been women who love to dress in an offbeat style and reinterpret current fashion wearing old clothes with a different twist.
Buying vintage clothes is about buying a whole story. Histories, fashion, heritage and memory.
That's what all the top designers do. They're constantly looking at past fashion styles and updating them, reinventing them, rewriting them. That was also true in the days of Monsieur Dior.
Vintage designer labels are popular, and guess who's top of the bill? Coco, of course.
It's a suit designed by Mademoiselle Chanel, probably dating back to 68 or 69. It's typical. The look was always very strict but extremely comfortable. You can imagine the woman under the garment. Not everything is shown, it's just implied.
Clothes like these are well thought out. They're structured like a sculpture, not conceived as a mere product.
When I acquire clothes, I'm buying the lining, the work. I'm also purchasing the quality as well as the research.
Vintage used to be called retro. In the 60s, clothes from the roaring 20s were all the rage. Then thrift stores selling clothes known as rags appeared in the 40s.
That's exactly what my grandmother was into after the war. It was known as la fripe. They sold American civilian clothes displayed on camp beds. They were second-hand.
Sarah's Vintage Emporium feels like a trip back in time. It's more like a museum show than a store.
That's a wedding dress, typical of 1900, with its high collar, entirely made of laces and by hand.
These may be antiques, but they were made to be worn at the time, and they still are a century later.
It's the dress your girlfriend will already have.
Finally, the story of 2 friends who started a website selling vintage clothes during the fashion blog boom, and one of them's still around to tell the tale.
There isn't an endless supply, as clothes of that quality are no longer made, they're consumed and bought in haste. People don't polish their shoes anymore. The products that we're making today, they're not meant to last. This also means that the vintage styles that we're enjoying today, that won't last forever.
Well, that remains to be seen. Look at Alexander McQueen, Hussein Chalayan, or Gareth Pugh.
It's better to buy a beautiful item twice a year rather than a lot of cheap clothes all year round. But that's just my point of view.
Such is the spirit behind the vogue for vintage clothes, eternal sunshine of the spotless mind.